So sticking with the topic of modifiers, last week we talked about modifiers that make your light softer, and this week we're going to talk about modifiers that make light harder, although as we'll find out that's not truly what happens. Don't forget, this is part of a weekly Learning How to Light course that I'm releasing on my YouTube channel. If you like what you're seeing, hit like, subscribe if you want to get notifications obviously, and if you've got any questions please stick them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. So on to modifiers that make the light harder. Now firstly, small apology. Strictly speaking, in physics terms, most modifiers that claim to make the light harder don't actually make it any harder at all, because they don't alter the actual size of the light source itself. What most modifiers that claim to make light harder do is actually simply channel down where light falls. There are ways of making light harder using lenses and Fresnels and things, but those are actually quite rare and you tend not to come across them. What you tend to come across are things like grids, snoots, reflectors and the rest. And photographers often talk about making light harder when what they really mean is in fact controlling the fall of light and where it's hitting your image. Now of course that's still a very, very important thing to do. It's just worth clearing that up ahead of time so you don't ever get caught in any arguments about physics, because nobody wants that. We can see what I mean by talking about one of the simplest modifiers used to control the spill of light and make it harder, a reflector. Most studio or battery flash heads come with, or can be fitted with, some sort of reflector, like this Zoom one on my Pro Photo. You may hear them being incorrectly referred to as making the light harder, but all they really do is control where the light falls, and you can see what I mean when we zoom this reflector in and out. Watch how the spotlight on the back wall changes in size. The quality of light doesn't really change. The light source is still the same 7-inch wide flash tube, but extending the reflector further out limits the fall of the light. Now we can take this one step further by using something called grids. A grid is basically a honeycomb pattern held in a disc that you pop onto the front of a light. They come in all shapes and sizes and are even available for softboxes, where they're known as egg boxes, and beauty dishes too. The size of the holes in the honeycomb pattern determine how tight the beam of light is. You can see here 3 different ones, a small, medium and large. They're usually marketed in degrees, which refers to the degree of the beam cast by them. And here you can see the effect of these small, medium and large grids on the width of beam they cast. Grids don't truly make the light harder, they simply channel it down tighter, allowing you to control where it falls. This can obviously be very useful when you're building up the light in your image. Essentially what grids allow you to do is feather the light very precisely. You'll remember we put a grid on a beauty dish earlier to demonstrate. Well, here's one on a softbox. The quality of light is still soft. What the grid has done is keep the light to a narrower channel. Watch how quickly it feathers away from you as I turn it away. Grids also absorb some light, and this can soon become a problem if your light isn't very powerful in the first place. This happens because although it may initially appear that what a grid is doing is focusing the light down into a smaller area, so you might think you're gaining quantity, what it's actually doing is blocking large amounts of the light from getting through to your subject. You can see here how we start with a certain number of beams of light, obviously a very hypothetical diagram here, and adding a grid blocks some of those beams of light. Now if you're simply trying to control where light falls, you may be better off with barn doors or flags. A flag is simply something you place in front of the light to control where it falls. Now the simplest version by far is something like this piece of black plastic with Velcro on, which I will stick on the side of this flash gun. The light from this flash gun can now not hit you because it's flagged off. At the more high end of the scale, you can buy or rent black fabric flags, which come in a wonderful array of sizes and shapes and can then be mounted and placed very professionally around the studio. They do the same job, but they look a bit more professional than this does. Some lights come with fittings called barn doors, which are essentially a flag for each side of the light on a hinge, so they can be swung in and out of the path of the light. You can see here how this tungsten light has had its barn doors closed down tight, which stops the light from spilling out all over the place. To really tighten down the beam of light, you can also use something called a snoot. This is basically a little light tunnel. In the case of flash heads, it would be a metal cone or similar system, but you can just as easily take a piece of black fabric like this with Velcro in the right places and wrap it around your flash gun and form, as neatly as that, a snoot. I've now made the beam from this flash gun very, very tight indeed. It will hit you here and it will be off as soon as I do that. So a very, very tightly controlled beam of light. On an even more basic level, you can use something called cinefoil. This is basically black painted aluminium foil. You can of course shape it into any form you like. I could replace this snoot with, say, a snoot like this and then tape it on, or I could put it over certain portions of a light to block out where the light is falling. A whole roll of it is fairly pricey, but of course a roll will last you your entire career, and you just cut off the bits you need and then fold them up and stash them in a camera bag. Yet again, another very useful tool to have. There's one last modifier I ought to mention, just for the sake of completeness, although they are pretty rare. And that's something called a Fresnel or Fresnel, depending on how you've been taught to pronounce it. Very simply, they are glass screens, like you see behind me on this vintage cinema light, that are cut in such a way that they focus down the beam of light. They're what you see in, like I say, old-fashioned film lights like this, in theatre lights. You can buy them or rent them as an attachment to a flash head, but they are very, very expensive. They work because the circles that have been cut into this pane of glass and the careful bits of grinding that have been done take the beam of light from behind that's tucked away in here and they focus it down. So in a sense they do actually make light hard. This effect can be accentuated by moving the light inside the housing. Again, obviously you can only do this with sort of old-fashioned lights. You can move the light further or closer from the Fresnel on the front, and that will widen or narrow the beam. If you're trying to create that classic theatre spotlight look of somebody caught in a really hard-edged light, this is the sort of light you're going to want. The reason I've left them till last is they are pretty rare, like I say. You don't come across them very often. Lights like this obviously aren't really knocking around much anymore, and as a flash attachment they're very, very expensive indeed. But got to mention it just out of completeness. To recap, most of the modifiers out there on the market that claim to make light harder aren't really doing so. What they're doing is controlling the fall of light. Now this is no bad thing, of course. We often want to control the fall of light. But don't be fooled, okay? Don't go out and buy something thinking, oh, this is going to transform my life. Just remember, all you're trying to do is control the fall of light. And you might be able to do that with something as simple as a piece of black fabric with a bit of Velcro on. Controlling the fall of light and tightening that beam down can have the effect of making the light look harder. Although don't forget the fundamental rules, those 4 characteristics of light. Your light source only becomes harder if its size in relation to your subject becomes considerably less, if it becomes a smaller and smaller light source. Okay, that's hard light modifiers. Next week I'm going to talk about the last type of modifier, although that's a very broad generalisation, and talk about lighting gels. I'll see you then.